Hello and welcome to the Weston Art Gallery. My name is Dennis Harrington. I'm director of the gallery, and today we're pleased to present a walking tour of Todd Pavlisko's exhibition, Pop Supernatural. I'd like to begin by giving some background information on the artist. Todd is a native to this area, grew up around Cincinnati in Oxford, Ohio, attended Miami University for his undergraduate degree, and later Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, where during that time he also worked at the Warhol Museum, which I believe played an important role and influence on his work. One of Todd's working strategies, and kind of his most significant working strategy, is what I'd like to refer to as mashups, and this idea of pitting seemingly disparate items together to create new meaning, or to create new understanding. And I think that is very evident in this series of work that's featured in the street level space of the Weston. If we look at this series of work that incorporate vintage 1970s NBA basketball prints. Todd's a lifelong basketball fan, just from his personal collection. And then these Edgerton frame prints that are imposed on top, again from the Edgerton estate, are seemingly in conflict, but basically these two opposing elements are intended to connect with one another. Dr. Harold Edgerton was a physicist who worked at MIT for many years, from the 30s up to the 90s, as a research scientist. He was responsible, among many other things, for helping to develop high-speed photography through the use of strobe lights. And in doing so, he was able to capture these split seconds of time, like in this photograph of a water droplet being thrust upward. And probably most famously for a photograph he did some years later of the bullet piercing an apple, which is a very famous photograph that he developed. Edgerton didn't think of himself as an artist, but his work became artwork. And in developing this high-speed photography, his work enabled these posters to be created in the 70s, because they both employ high-speed photography. They both capture a split second of time. So this really graceful shot by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar here, this really beautiful droplet of water bouncing up off this liquid form, are really kind of seen as both in the same realm and creating the same meaning. And these two pieces, basketball, violin, 1 and 2, he's incorporating a found object, a ready-made object, in this case an NBA basketball, and in the case of the red, white, and blue, a vintage American Basketball Association basketball. For me, conjure images of the surrealists, particularly Salvador Dali, who had these kind of liquid, kind of drooping forms and kind of melting watches and things in some of his paintings. And we see the violin drooped over the basketball, and it could be considered, two objects in conflict with each other or opposing each other, but or the violin embracing the basketball. And really, I think for me, these become these two forms of classical music and basketball combined together. Really is about performance and about graceful performance. If we think of a musician, a performer, gracefully playing the violin with the bow running over the strings, and a basketball player, a fade jumper, capturing that moment and the beauty of the ball going through the hoop. So those things are things he's making together, and really, again, putting these two forms on equal ground, and they both, in their own way, contribute to the cultural richness of our society. And again, in these three neon works that appear to be kind of like, Todd thinks of these as kind of frozen word bubbles, or capturing this one little moment. And encased in each one of these word bubbles are these very expensive high fashion shoes by Louis Vuitton and Zanotti that kind of like cage desire, or they're inaccessible to the work. And then he's included these specific word phrases that have meaning to him or influence on him, but again come from different parts of the cultural landscape. Bertha Cool is a jazz reference, refers to the age of Bird, but also Charlie Parker, but also maybe more of an indirect reference to a famous Miles Davis album that was recorded in the late 50s called Birth of the Cool. And then Time Kills, which was a phrase that he's lifted from a Chris Burden performance video, which appears at the very end of the performance. And then also Milk and Honey, which really goes back to kind of biblical references, but is a phrase commonly referred to, the land of promise or promised land. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, these works are from 4 or 5 years ago, but the piece suspended above my head is from an ongoing series that Todd has worked on for many years called All the Money I Found in a Year, which is essentially walking the streets of New York City when the artist lived there. He would find money on a daily basis, would collect it, catalog it, categorize it, ultimately have it gold-plated, and then create a sculptural installation out of these coins in various forms. In this case, this piece was newly created for the Weston for this show. Another basketball reference. The coins are sitting atop this half-inch plexiglass form that's 4 foot in diameter. It's purposely situated 10 feet off the ground, which is the height of a basketball hoop, and also laid out in the configuration of a basketball using the pennies without gold plating to delineate the form of the basketball. And in doing this was kind of a running commentary, I think, of Todd's about art as commodity. And we often tend to think of the value of art being attributed to how much it's worth or how much it's sold for. You hear so often these auctions where works of art are sold for millions of dollars or purchased for millions of dollars, and people so often tend to confuse that with the value of the work. And in this case, I think he's kind of flipped the tables on that notion by making the artwork is made of money. So again, it creates a whole different dialogue about that whole aspect of the way we look at the value of art. So as we descend into the Weston's lower galleries, we encounter all new work by Todd Pavlisko, nicely introduced by this series of Pez pellets that introduce this series of monumental Pez sculptures that are featured throughout the galleries downstairs. So as we enter the lower galleries, there's a series of 6 monumental Pez sculptures. And again, working the way that Todd has worked in this previous series of work upstairs, we have this kind of unlikely combination of these traditional portraits, bust portraits of famous individuals from both the pop and contemporary world and historical reference. We'll see in some of the other sculptures, sitting atop these Pez candy dispensers. There were a couple things that interested him in the Pez container itself. One that is a hollow interior where you put the Pez pellets could work as a time capsule component, an aspect he's very interested in his own work. particularly having worked at the Warhol Museum, and among many other things that Warhol did, he had a fascination with time capsules, and I think he had, over the years, had collected hundreds of shoe boxes with different materials in them. And then also in working with these various characters that are represented throughout the exhibition, and here we have David Hammons, who is a contemporary African-American artist, I think a personal hero to Todd, a bit of a renegade, and has had great cultural impact. He's reclusive, operates kind of outside the traditional commercial gallery situation and also the contemporary museum world, but yet, despite that, has been very successful and a strong voice for African American concerns, and continues to be so. And another feature of the Pez sculptures, I think, for Todd is by combining these recognizable, contemporary, in some cases historical characters with these Pez containers, he's kind of forcing a dialogue about who these individuals were, what their contributions were, and in some cases hoping for the public to rediscover or to think about these individuals in a different way. People might ask, or viewers might get, what do these individuals have to do with one another? And I think it's a similar approach that Todd employs in the work in the street level space of the Weston, of decategorizing or combining people from various aspects of the cultural landscape, and that in destroying hierarchies again, but also that they've all had great influence on the cultural landscape. They've all had impact. They've all been agents of change, and I think that is the connecting link between all these figures here. And this is for Todd, for the artist, this is about admiration, and this is about consideration, and about examining these people in greater depth to see the way that they've impacted our world. These pieces are all created from mahogany wood. There was a process where Todd worked with collaborators, as he does with much of his work. They were done in sections in order to be able to utilize the 5-axis router to its full capacity, glued together. And then the Pez chambers themselves are hollow. They all have this opening on the side, like a locker room door or locker at a school door, that enables these to be filled with components that the artist intends as part of a time capsule notion to carry this further. So as we enter the Weston's East Gallery, the Pez sculptures continue, and in this room we have Frederick Douglass that kind of greets visitors as they're coming through. It's a really wonderful shot of Frederick as you're moving into the East Gallery. And then the figure I'm standing next to, Rosa Parks, and then finally James Baldwin flanks her on the left here. Frederick Douglass is probably the most historical, goes back the furthest in history among this collection. That will be a continuing series that Todd is working on. Frederick, of course, being from the Civil War era, former slave, but has had huge cultural impact that still resonates today in issues that we deal with social justice for African Americans and for other groups in the United States and elsewhere that have continued to strive for justice and freedom. Obviously, this group in this room have a very powerful connection in terms of social justice issues, but things that are still very current and relevant to today's society. And then finally, another aspect of the Pez cylinder, the Pez candy connection, I think, is this idea of sweetness or goodness associated with the notion of sugar, and that idea is extended, and this kind of extended from these Pez sculptures onto the floor and throughout the gallery with these ready-made sculptures that conclude a sledgehammer, bag of sugar in combination. And if you think of a sledgehammer as an agent of change, like these individuals, or something that can break down barriers, they serve as an extension of this idea. And then resting atop these bags of sugar, The sugar is, in a way, kind of mimics the Pez pellet that goes inside these dispensers, but also sugar kind of represents the idea of sweetness or goodness. If you think of phrases like sweet justice, sweet liberty, sweet freedom. So the two in combination extend the notion that's within the sculptures. And the fact that they're arranged in this kind of grid-like pattern throughout the gallery, for me, suggests these kind of cultural markers in time, or suggests cultural events that have occurred throughout our history, like a calendar of events. And also, and finally, the fact that the sugar brand, this domino, for me, suggests the idea of change can have a domino effect. Well, I'd like to thank you for joining us on this virtual tour today of Todd Pavlisko's exhibition, Pop Supernatural. And I would encourage you to take a look at our website at westonartgallery.com for further information and images about the exhibition, and also visit our Facebook page. Thank you again.